iniziare.
Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome for being here. I'm Valentina Foschi, and it's a great pleasure today to welcome all of you to the third webinar or the fourth series of Think Outside the Box, which is this EFL Teacher Professional Development series we started 4 years ago. It is organized by Liceo Nolfi-Apolloni in Fano together with Mediateca Montanari. Now, today, first of all, I would like to thank Macmillan Education and Mondadori Education. And in particular, we've got here Kazimir Kukielka, who is the regional manager for Italy, Greece, Malta, and Cyprus, and Romina Pifferi, who is the sales representative for Italy. I would also like to thank Marco Camilletti, who is the Mondadori Education and Macmillan Education local agent for the Machi region. Of course, I would like to thank also Ethan Mansur, who is our speaker today. Let me tell you a couple of things, really a few words about Ethan. He has a very long experience in English language teaching. He has always focused on preparing students for B2 first, C1 advanced, and C2 proficiency examinations. And he's also an oral examiner for Cambridge and IELTS. He currently teaches at IH Madrid, and he's also co-author of Ready to Be First, which is a series by Macmillan. Today, we'll deal with how we should prepare our students for certifications and for B2 First exam in particular. But he will also focus on how we should encourage students to develop creative and critical thinking when preparing for the exams. So thank you for Macmillan Education and Mondadori Education for this long-lasting cooperation. As many of you know, we started this Think Outside the Box experience 4 years ago. And we used to hold our seminars at Mediateca Montanari in presence, okay, in the wonderful Sala Ipogea conference room, okay, which is an amazing, wonderful room, conference room, which sits really on the Roman remains of Fano, okay, which date back to the 1st century BC. This year, we hold our seminars online due to the current pandemic situation, unfortunately. On the other hand, the good side of it is that many of you who are present today, okay, can be present because we are online. So there is an advantage that we can share this experience with so many teachers from all over Italy, and there are also some of you who are joining from abroad. So I'm very happy to welcome you all here. A couple of additional pieces of information. It's also a pleasure to inform all of you that starting this year, not only we have widened our range of collaborations. We have our next seminar, which will be on the 29th of April, which is together, it's a collaboration with the Italian Virginia Woolf Society. But also starting this year, this initiative, Think Outside the Box, is organized under the patronage of the municipality of Fano. So we've got il patrocinio del Comune di Fano, which is a very important recognition. Another thing I want to tell you all is that the initiative is on Piattaforma Sofia, so which is the Italian Ministry of Education platform portal for the professional development series and seminars. One piece of information which I think is interesting for you as well is that it doesn't matter if you didn't register on Sophia, but you can have the final certificate, which will be sent to you via email You will get it after the conclusion of the whole series, okay, so later on. Having said that, let me introduce Professor Samuele Giombi, who is the headmaster of Liceo Nolfi-Apolloni, who is going to bring his welcome to you. And also I want to introduce Dottoressa Valeria Patrignani, who is giving her welcome. She's in charge of the library system of Comune di Fano, of the municipal administration of Fano, and she's going to give her welcome on behalf of the municipal administration of Fano and the library system. Before passing on to Professor Giombi, let me thank you, all of you who are present today with us, and I hope you will appreciate this webinar and this afternoon together. Thank you, everybody, and Professor Giombi, passo la parola a lei. I can't see him, actually.
Sì.
Yes. Professor Giombi,
ecco, ok, bene, grazie di nuovo. Molto rapidamente, solo per dire queste tre rapide cose in rapidissima sequenza. La prima è davvero grazie a nome del nostro liceo Nolfi-Apolloni. È una realtà questa di thinking outside the box che ha ormai quasi una tradizione, perché ha alcuni anni, almeno 3 anni di vita se non erro, e che non abbiamo voluto in nessun modo interrompere. Eravamo tentati di farlo a causa della pandemia e alla impossibilità quindi di proseguire in presenza questa attività. Però sarebbe stata davvero una tentazione che è stato provvidenziale respingere e che quindi abbiamo davvero voluto respingere. Siamo contenti di averlo fatto. La seconda cosa è unirmi ai ringraziamenti che sono stati già fatti da parte della professoressa Valentina Foschi, che ringrazio davvero, che è un po' l'anima, la mente e finanche il braccio, almeno per quanto riguarda il nostro liceo, di questa attività. Non finirò mai di ringraziarla. Insieme a lei tutti i partner esterni che sono già stati citati e per i ringraziamenti dei quali mi associo, mi unisco. E la terza e ultima cosa, davvero rapidissima, è che è mio dovere non togliere tempo davvero ai relatori, a coloro che interverranno, e quindi mi impongo davvero di chiudere davvero qui, ringraziandovi ancora e augurando a tutti buon lavoro a nome del nostro liceo.
Grazie Samuele. Valeria Patrignani.
Grazie Valentina, grazie professor Giombi, scusate l'italiano anche e soprattutto per chi ci sta seguendo dall'estero. Per noi è un onore ospitare adesso in questa forma virtuale Think Outside the Box per il 4º anno. Come ho detto da subito a Valentina Foschi quando condivise l'idea con noi, quando ci portò questo nuovo progetto, non poté che essere davvero piena di entusiasmo ad accoglierlo, perché perlomeno sul nostro territorio è davvero qualcosa di unico. Non sono tante le occasioni di questo tipo in cui viene promossa la lingua inglese e in cui c'è una collaborazione stretta tra scuola e biblioteca e quindi territorio, con un'apertura a tutto il territorio, perché queste sono occasioni chiaramente organizzate dalla scuola in collaborazione con gli editori, rivolte sicuramente molti in prima battuta agli insegnanti, ma aperte a tutti. Ecco, questa era la speranza che avevamo io e Valentina da subito, quella che in molti potessero approfittare di questa occasione. La lingua inglese è, come dire, una competenza fondamentale per potersi orientare nel mondo, per poter lavorare, ma per poter avere relazioni, per poter viaggiare, per arricchirsi. Ecco, credo che stiate facendo un grande lavoro, quindi da parte nostra, da parte del Comune di Fano, da parte della Mediateca Montanari del sistema bibliotecario, un ringraziamento enorme al Liceo Nolfi-Apolloni, al dirigente, a Valentina Foschi, per averci coinvolto fin da subito e per continuare questo progetto che speriamo si rafforzi sempre di più. Un benvenuto agli ospiti, ai relatori, a Macmillan Education e Mondadori Education, che ho avuto già il piacere di incontrare nelle precedenti edizioni. E quindi insomma benvenuti di nuovo. Valentina prima ha citato la nostra mediateca, la nostra sala ipogea con gli scavi romani. Ecco, sono spazi che ci mancano moltissimo, però è vero che questo digitale ci dà una grandissima opportunità. Oggi siamo in 257 più alcune persone anche che ci stanno seguendo su YouTube. Certo, insomma, il mondo sta davvero molto cambiando e quindi ne dobbiamo approfittare per quanto è possibile, però l'invito a venire, a tornare alla Mediateca Montanari a Fano e a vedere la nostra città e a conoscere il nostro sistema bibliotecario lo faccio a tutti. Quindi buon lavoro e buon ascolto, grazie davvero a tutti, ai relatori e agli editori e alla scuola.
Valentina, I think your mic is off.
Thank you, Valeria. I'm sorry, my microphone was off. Thank you, Ethan. I'll pass on to Ethan. To all the participants, please have a look at the chat because there will be a link for you to fill in a Google form for the participation and the final certificate. Thank you, Ethan, to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to Valentina, to Montadori, and Macmillan for inviting me to be here. It's an honor. And yeah, I just want to say thanks to all the teachers out there that are making time for this. I'm a teacher too, and I know that sometimes it's hard to make time for professional development. So I appreciate you making time for this event. So as Valentina was saying, this talk is going to focus on exam preparation, but it'll also focus on critical thinking and how those two things can complement each other, and that critical thinking can be part of our exam preparation courses, and I think it should be. So just to give you an idea of what we'll be talking about, I'm going to start with a quick introduction to higher order thinking skills. That's a good place to start when you're talking about critical thinking, sort of talking about the thinking skills that lead to learning. And then basically the rest of the talk will be very practical. I'll be talking about some activities that you can do in class involving the 4 parts of the exam, and how you can integrate a bit more critical thinking into the preparation that you do related to those parts of the exam. So we'll start with speaking and then use of English and writing, and we'll finish with reading and listening. I realize that reading and use of English are actually together, but I've separated them for a reason that I'll explain a little bit later. So let's get started with higher order thinking skills. So I'm sure everyone out there is very familiar with this term, particularly if you've attended professional development like thinking outside the box. We talk a lot about higher order thinking when we think about creativity and critical thinking. So one kind of place to start when you're thinking about critical thinking and creative thinking is Bloom's taxonomy. This was developed in the 1950s, and basically Benjamin Bloom, the one who created this, sort of graphic that you're seeing here, he was very concerned with the fact that during the 1950s, at least, students were spending a bit too much time on what are called lower order thinking skills, just spending a lot of time in class remembering things and understanding things. And perhaps they weren't spending enough time doing so-called higher order thinking, analyzing or evaluating things. And I think this is still a useful framework to work with. I think it's a good reminder for us when we're planning our lessons that they shouldn't be dominated by lower order thinking. And they also shouldn't be dominated by higher order thinking either. A class that was only higher order thinking would be quite exhausting, as I'm sure you know. But the only thing I don't like about this way of looking at it is that it kind of gives the impression that the lower order thinking skills are kind of inferior to the higher order things, that we're like trying to climb a mountain and reach the top where, you know, the highest order of thinking creativity is. That's not really true. As a language teacher, as language teachers, we know that remembering is very important in language learning. If you can't remember new words and phrases, you're going to be in trouble when you're learning a new language. So it's not that the higher order thinking skills are somehow better or more important. The point that Bloom was trying to make is that that there should be a better balance between them, and that's why I prefer to look at it this way. I prefer to think of it as sort of a continuum that you move back and forth from. That not that you're climbing up, but you're sort of going from one side to the other. A good example of that is sort of a typical language lesson where you might start with something creative, like a brainstorming activity, for example, at the beginning of the lesson. But then you might move right into a comprehension activity. You might give them something to read, which would be understanding. And at that point, you might sort of select some language from that text to analyze, maybe doing some type of guided discovery, which would involve analysis. And then you might apply that and then finish with some type of creative, maybe communicative activity. So as you can see, I think in the language classroom, we're actually doing a pretty good job, I think, of balancing lower and higher order thinking skills. However, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that perhaps in exam preparation courses, there isn't quite as much balance as perhaps there should be. I think that there's kind of an added element to exam preparation courses that maybe perhaps de-emphasizes higher order thinking to a degree, because we're focusing so much on the strategies that students need in order to pass the exam. We're focusing on giving the students useful practice with all the different parts of the exam. And I think that in particular, critical thinking is perhaps not emphasized enough in exam preparation courses. It's one thing that I've been trying to incorporate more into my exam preparation courses. And by the way, Benjamin Bloom, the one who created this taxonomy, he never used the term critical thinking, but generally speaking, it's sort of understood to be a higher order thinking skill related to analyzing and evaluating, among other sort of thinking processes. So now I'm going to give you an example of the importance of critical thinking within the context of one of these standardized exams. I'll be focusing on the B2 first, because it's an exam that I've prepared, probably hundreds of students for by now. And I also wrote a teacher's book for the Ready for B2 First series. So it's something that I know well. And if you look at the handbook for teachers that's published by Cambridge Assessment, I'm sure all of you out there who prepare students for this exam will be familiar with it. It's a free document that contains a lot of very useful information about the exam, including what type of tasks students will need to be doing on the exam and the explanation of what they have to do. And I think if you look at those explanations, it's not hard to find references to thinking, sort of cognitive processing, that would be sort of fall into the category of critical thinking. So I think a good example is the reading and use of English part 5. This is just a typical, multiple choice exam task. You have your text and then you have your questions over here. But in order to answer those questions correctly on the B2 first, it's not a matter of just understanding the text. It's not lower order thinking. It of course involves lower order thinking, but there's also some higher order thinking. You have to understand the attitude, the purpose, the tone, the implication of what the writer is trying to say in the text. And when you think about it, that's critical thinking. That's reading between the lines. You're definitely accessing some of that sort of higher order thinking there. And also, when you think about it, if you are asked to sort of look at a text and think about the organization features and how that's contributing to the meaning, that's also an example of critical thinking as well. So, But of course, critical thinking isn't limited just to the reading and use of English paper. Actually, there's critical thinking also in the writing section. So if you don't mind, in the chat box, I'd like you just to write any words in this explanation here that you would associate with critical thinking. So I'm just going to open my chat box here so I can see what everybody's writing. So again, just so somebody wrote awareness. Is that one of the words here? Sequencing, yeah, exemplifying, great. Great. Contrasting and comparing, somebody wrote. Giving reasons, yes. Great, so I'll just show you so we can kind of, we can sort of have a conversation about to what degree critical thinking is involved in these different aspects of the writing task. But I think that when I've done this type of task myself, when you're, for example, disagreeing with something, that involves thinking about something from someone else's perspective, sort of putting yourself in someone else's shoes and thinking about their point of view and thinking about sort of maybe why you don't think it's correct. And also this idea of comparing and contrasting, finding links, that's definitely critical thinking as well. And also there's creativity, of course, as well in writing. You have to come up with your own ideas. But once you've come up with your ideas, you also have to think of the best way of supporting those ideas, which involves an aspect of creative thinking. So as you can see here, those different sort of cognitive processes, creativity and critical thinking, they're not separate. They in fact may be actually going on at the same time, or they may be linked. So let's just take a quick look at other parts of the exam. But we'll just take a quick look at the listening. So there's actually sort of, I think, less critical thinking going on in the listening, to be fair. But there is sometimes where you are listening for the speaker's attitude. And so you're not listening for exactly what they say, but you're listening for what they mean, what they're sort of implying, which is certainly critical thinking. And also finally in the speaking task, there's quite a bit of critical and creative thinking going on in that task when you think about it. So the part 3 collaborative task is when the students have to talk together. They're given a topic and they have to discuss the different options. And then they have to reach an agreement or try to reach an agreement about those options. And so if you're sort of negotiating a decision or an idea with somebody else, that involves quite a bit of critical thinking when you think about it. You're sort of listening to the other person, incorporating their ideas into your own, trying to find common ground between your 2 points of view, perhaps. Again, lots of critical thinking going on there. So I think that at this point, I hope I've made a convincing argument that critical thinking definitely has a place in exam preparation if we're going to be thinking about preparing our students for this type of exam. All right, if everybody could just turn off their mics, it seems like there's some background noise now. I think we can probably agree with John Hughes here, who has written a number of exam preparation books, but he is also one of the authors of this book, Critical Thinking in ELT, which is a very interesting book about critical thinking if you're interested in reading more about it. Basically what he's saying is that actually we need to be thinking more about critical thinking in exam preparation courses, not less. And I would agree with that. So now, I'm kind of done talking about the importance of critical thinking. So I want to talk mostly about how to do it in class. What does this actually look like in class, sort of adding more critical thinking to an exam preparation course? So my first activity is related to the speaking section. And that's to do with one of these videos that you can find easily on YouTube of other students, of candidates doing the exam. As many of you, probably all of you, will know, these videos are very useful when you're preparing students for the exam. There's nothing quite like watching other students, even students your age, doing the exam to give you like a very clear idea of what's going on in the exam. So I've used these videos in various ways over the years. I've had students watch them, sort of take notes about what's going on in the exam, what's going on in each part of the exam. I've also asked students, again, I'm hearing quite a bit of background noise. If maybe one of the hosts could try to silence people's microphones if they haven't done so themselves. Where was I? Let me continue here. But one thing I've started doing more recently, as I've become more interested in critical thinking, is that I've gotten students to watch the video, and I've given them questions to think about that not only familiarize them with the exam format, which is an important thing to do in exam preparation, but also get them to sort of critically analyze the task itself, the tasks themselves. So, for example, it's useful to know, for example, how many examiners there are, because when you walk into the room and there's 2 people who are going to be listening to you, you don't want to be surprised by that. But it's perhaps more interesting in class to talk about why there are 2 examiners. And also, it's very useful to think about sort of identify the different parts of the exam and think about what you have to do in those different parts. But it's also very interesting to think about why those type of specific tasks are on the exam. So why is Cambridge asking me to talk for 1 minute by myself about some pictures? Why am I given this collaborative task? Why am I talking to one of my fellow candidates and not only to the examiner? These are all very interesting things to talk about with students. And it's very interesting how insightful students can be. I think particularly teenagers. If you ask them the right questions and you get them thinking, they can come up with some very interesting, insightful observations about the exam. I just did this just the other day, actually with a C1 preparation course. And these are teenagers, and they were saying, so maybe there are 2 examiners because it creates more subjectivity or objectivity in the exam. If there's 2 people listening to me, maybe one is tired or something, and the other one is, listening more carefully, or maybe this one picks up on something, this one doesn't. So getting students to think about that is interesting and engaging, but also, actually, it helps them remember things better, because this type of high order thinking, it involves deeper processing in your brain, and that's associated with learning, and it's associated with memory. So by doing this type of thing, you are actually helping students learn and remember the information better than they would if they were just asked to simply do some type of lower order thinking activity where they were just kind of answering questions about the exam. So my next activity is also related to the speaking. We've been talking about this collaborative task. So we were saying that this task, while you're doing it, involves some degree of critical thinking. You're coming to an agreement with another person, or trying to reach one. One thing you can do in class, which I found very interesting, very engaging, is actually get students to create their own speaking tasks. I'm sure I'm not the first person to have thought of this idea. I'm sure many people have tried it out there now. This is a worksheet that I created for the teacher's book for Ready for B2 First, the new edition. And so I'm just going to quickly take you through kind of the process that I have used with my students with this activity, because I've done this many times. I actually, before I give them the worksheet, I actually ask them to analyze example tasks. So you could sort of have them look at the book, for example, look at the different tasks in the book, or you could maybe put some examples from past papers up on the wall, and they could go look at it. And in more small groups, they can discuss and try to sort of analyze, like, what type of questions are on there, what type of prompts are on there. And also, you'll notice I put some critical thinking in there too. So why do you think they give you prompts, for example? Why don't they just give you a question? Why are they giving you these prompts to talk about? Again, leading to some interesting, I think, conversations in class, in my experience. So at that point, once they've kind of analyzed the past tasks, the example tasks, they would go on to create their own, which of course involves creativity when you think about it. And I think this is actually a good example of how critical thinking and creative thinking kind of work together. That if you're doing some critical thinking before the creative task, before you're asking the students to be creative, the actual creative product is better. It's sort of higher quality. And the final thing you do is actually have the students do the task. They've created it. And I have them exchange it with another group, so they're not doing their own. And just as kind of a tangent, when I'm doing this type of simulation of an exam in class, I try to simulate exam conditions as much as I can. So instead of just having the students do it in pairs, because there are only going to be 2 people talking, you could do it in pairs. I do it in groups of 3 or even 4, and I'll have one student be the examiner, be the interlocutor, the one who sort of talks to the candidates. And I give that person, you know, a stopwatch like this one, or I let them use their mobile phone to time the candidates doing the task, and also give them some instructions to read. So they're actually reading the same instructions as the examiner would on the day of the exam. And I think this is important in exam preparation because on the day of the exam, there really shouldn't be any surprises. The students should go in and they should be thoroughly familiar with the format of the exam, including sort of the timing and the instructions. And that sort of relaxes them when you think about it. If there's no, if nothing is surprising, they're going to feel more comfortable and therefore probably, you know, give a better performance in terms of their English language ability. And then the last thing that I do is I actually have them do a reflection task. So that, and then I sort of put the groups together and I have them discuss the task that they made and maybe think about how they could be improved. Maybe some of the prompts were actually not that interesting to talk about. Maybe the question was kind of a little bit too hard or maybe too easy. Maybe you kind of ran out of things to talk about related to the topic. And this type of reflection task, sort of thinking about things, how things could be better, how they could be improved, is also closely related with critical thinking. The idea of reflection itself is itself a critical thinking activity. So I just thought I'd mention that if you read about 21st century skills, if you read books like this one, 21st Century Skills in the ELT Classroom, or this one, English for 21st Century Skills, I think you'll find that this is the type of task, one of the types of tasks that they're really advocating for in class. You're giving students something difficult to do, something that has a clear objective, and you're asking them to do it together in groups. And so that type of activity includes critical and creativity if it's sort of a difficult task like what I'm talking about. But of course, it also includes collaboration and communication as well. So the task that I just demonstrated to you includes all of the 4 C's from this framework for 21st century skills. And I think we can all agree that these are the types of skills that ideally we want our students to be learning. And for me, there's no reason not to try to incorporate them into an exam preparation course. I think actually it's a good place to develop these skills. So I'm going to move on to use of English, but actually the use of English task that I am going to present, it's actually the same as the speaking one. So basically one thing that I've done with my students is I've had them create their own use of English tasks. And an easy one to do actually is the part 2. This is the one where they're just sort of empty words that you have to, empty gaps that you have to fill in. And so when you think about really to create the task, the students just need a text and they need to choose 8 words they're going to take out of that text. So in terms of sort of preparation, it doesn't actually require that much. But again, in order for them to do a good job of creating one of these, I think they really need to analyze examples of this type of task, maybe give them sort of 5 or 6 to look at, including the answers, of course, and get them thinking about what's being tested in this part of the exam. So I was thinking that I had shown you some questions that I gave my students when they were in this sort of analysis stage of the task for the speaking part 3. I was thinking maybe in the chat box, you could give me some examples of questions that you could give your students if you wanted them to do this type of task in class. So so picture the students in groups. You've given them some examples of the tasks. use of English and reading and use of English part 2. What type of questions could you ask them to answer sort of in their groups while they're looking at the examples? So I'll just give you a moment to put that in the chat box. Okay. Claudia says, what type of words? Yes, everyone's focusing on the types of words that you remove, because that's actually very important when you think about it. If students are going to be able to do this task on the exam, they really need to know what type of words are being taken out. Great, I like what is being tested. That's a good question to ask students, for sure. What's missing? Yes. Basically, ones that questions that I've had were related to the type of words they were missing, and getting students to identify the fact that primarily in this task they're taking out prepositions, modal verbs, auxiliaries, sort of grammar type words, as well as prepositions. But you can also get them to think about the task itself. So, for example, how many words are missing? Oh, there's 8 words missing. And also think about where they are in the text. So for example, if you look at this text, you'll notice that there isn't more than one gap in one sentence. And they do that on purpose because if you put them too close together, one answer might actually depend on the other one. So you might actually need to get this answer right in order to get the next one right, which would be bad on an exam. So you can get them to notice this type of thing and sort of and talk about it. So obviously at this point, you'd get them to create their own. I've done this in various ways. I've had them find their own text using a computer, for example, or their mobile phone, and then decide which words to take out. Or you can simply give them like a photocopy of one of the tasks and just give them like a black marker that they can use to just cross out the words. And then, of course, they would exchange with the other students, do the reflection task, and think about, maybe some of the words that they chose were impossible to guess. Maybe some of them were too easy. Maybe there was actually too many possibilities. Maybe there was sort of 10 possibilities for words that could be put in. And I think doing this type of thing really familiarizes students with the task on a different level than it is just kind of explaining that information to them. I just wanted to note that I've also done this with use of English, reading and use of English part 3, the word formation one. Again, this one's pretty easy to create actually for students because all they have to do is blank out a word and then put a stem word over here. So it's relatively easy in terms of kind of preparation. So I know that many of you out there are probably thinking now, doesn't this take a lot of time? Isn't this a time-consuming thing to do? Isn't this going to take my whole lesson, basically? And that's true. That is definitely one aspect of this type of activity. But I think that it's worth investing this time. And I think that maybe sometimes with exam preparation courses, I think we get into this kind of rhythm where it's like a race. We're trying to like get to the finish line, make sure all our students are ready by the date of the exam. There's so many different parts of the exam to prepare them for. But I think actually a better metaphor for exam preparation is a journey, that you arrive when you arrive, and that in order to get there, you're going to have to do a lot of work, of course, but you're not going to have to do it all at an incredible pace, slowing down, changing the rhythm. I think these things can be good things for exam preparation courses, sort of breaking up the rhythm of what can sometimes be monotonous exam preparation, sort of the repetition of the same type of reading activity, etc. And in my experience, it's also very engaging. It's an interesting thing to do with students. Students like it. And also, lastly, I would add that I think it actually improves their marks on the exam. I think they do better as a result of doing this type of thing, because as Peter May says in his book, Exam Classes, which is a great book about exam preparation. If you're interested in exam preparation, it's got a lot of really interesting ideas. It definitely opened my mind to the kind of creative possibilities of exam preparation. And yeah, this idea of kind of getting students to create their own tasks, I didn't think of this, it comes from this book. And what he says is that basically getting students to really to do this type of exercise and engage with the exam this way, it really it gives them sort of an insight into the working of the exam that helps them actually perform better. So we're going to move on to writing before we do the reading and the listening. So in the writing section, I think that there's sort of different ways you could prepare students for this part of the test. You know, one way would be just simply giving them kind of a list of information about each one of the writing. You know, you could say, well, the writing has to be this length. You have to use paragraphs. You have to use linking words and phrases. You have to do all these things. Now go and write. That would be one way of doing it. But of course, that's not the way that course books usually do it. It's not the way that they do it in this Macmillan, the new Macmillan Ready for B2 First book. The author of this book, Roy Norris, has used an inductive approach to writing. So what he's done is basically trying to familiarize the student with the type of task in an inductive way, sort of in a discovery type of way. So for example, here at the beginning, it actually starts with a bit of creativity, a bit of sort of brainstorming about what you would be interested in talking about related to my favorite sport in this case. And then the students move on and they look at an example task, similar to what we were doing before in this kind of analysis stage at the beginning. And here they're thinking about the structure of the text. They're looking at the example and thinking about the structure. And then they're thinking about the target reader, the register. So they're sort of going through a genre analysis before they get to the point where they're actually going to answer the question. They're going to answer the exam test themselves. And again, you can kind of see this connection between critical thinking and creativity, how they're linked, and they can sort of work in tandem. And that's what's going on in the course book in this case. So I just wanted to give you one more kind of little bit creative idea. This is something I've done with my students. So the idea is that you do a genre transfer. So you basically give the students a piece of writing in one genre, and you ask them to transfer it to a new genre, to basically change it. So here you would be giving the students an article, and you'd be asking them to turn it into an essay. And so that might seem like kind of a wacky idea, but actually in practice, it works with a lot of the same kind of skills and sort of thinking skills that are involved in that inductive approach that we just saw. In order to basically transfer the information and sort of reformulate it, you really need to understand both of those formats and registers. You need to know a lot about the article, but also about the essay and how they're different. And I think it's particularly useful for this because in my experience, my students, sometimes they write an article that sounds a little bit too much like an essay. I don't know if you have this problem as well, but they'll sort of start their articles in a way that sounds like they're writing an essay. And in this type of activity really raises their awareness of the difference between them. So you can maybe try give this one a shot sometime. So we're gonna finish with the reading and the listening. And I put these together, as I mentioned earlier, because actually I think that the type of critical thinking activities that at least I've done with my students, they sort of work the same way with reading and listening, because they're both receptive tasks. You're basically sort of listening or reading and trying to understand. So basically, in this case, I would have the students do the regular reading task. And they would sort of, they would do the regular matching, all of that stuff. And then basically at the end of the task, when you've already corrected it, oftentimes what you do naturally in class is you do some type of personalization activity where students are thinking about it, sort of reflecting on the topic, thinking about their own opinion about it, which is a wonderful thing to do. I wouldn't want to say that's a bad idea, but I think that sometimes you can replace that type of personalization activity with a critical thinking one. So this is an example of a critical thinking activity that I put into the B2 First exam preparation book, the teacher's book. Basically what you're doing here is you're getting the students to think about the writer's purpose, maybe thinking about how objective the author is being, whether whether you actually agree with the writer's argument, is it persuasive? And again, this type of question, it's difficult. And I actually noticed somebody in the chat box saying that that it's interesting but difficult. And I think that I think sometimes we underestimate our students. Giving them something difficult like this can be very interesting and engaging, in my experience. I think teenagers often want the freedom to question something, to really give their opinion about it, and maybe even argue against it. That's actually a pretty interesting thing, I think, for students to do. And they're perfectly capable of it as well. Maybe not the first time you do it in class, but if you kind of get them used to this type of activity, they get better at it, of course, which is the goal, isn't it? To help them develop their critical thinking. So just to finish, there are lots of other sort of post-reading or post-listening activities you can do. You can get the students to think about assumptions that sort of are behind what the writer is saying or the speaker is saying. Maybe thinking about which parts of the text involve fact and which parts involve fiction, sort of opinion. Maybe even thinking about what is missing from the text. That can actually be a very interesting conversation to have with teenagers. What's missing from the coursebook? What didn't get mentioned? You know, that can be an interesting conversation to have. And what you're doing with this type of activity is you're getting the students to engage in some close reading and also sort of the general idea of the text as well, in a way that will help them actually answer questions on the exam. But it'll also help them develop information literacy skills, because they're sort of, with the rise of the internet, there's a lot of information out there that's not particularly reliable, that maybe hasn't really been fact checked, and that sort of developing this instinct or this habit of questioning things, I think can be a very powerful one for young people or adults, for that matter. So that's basically the end of my presentation. Just to remind you what we've done, we've talked about sort of higher order thinking skills, focusing on critical thinking, and then we've talked about some hopefully useful activities for you to bring to your classes. So the last activity I want to do is a reflection activity. As I mentioned, reflection itself is associated with critical thinking. So I thought I could finish with that. So I want you in the chat box to tell me what activities or ideas from this presentation you think might be useful or interesting to do with your students. So I'll just give you a moment to put your ideas in the chat box. People like the collaborative task, where they make their own. People like the genre transfer idea. Yeah, the DIY. Great. It seems like a lot of people like that, either the DIY task where you're having students create their own, or this genre transfer idea. So I would really encourage you to give these a try. Hopefully they're the type of activity that's not going to create too much work for you. They're sort of low prep activities. And yeah, as I said before, they might be difficult a little bit, but I think it's maybe only because students haven't been asked to do it before. So if you kind of support them, particularly the first time, you'll find that students do get better at this type of thing. I've watched my students get better at it. And in doing so, I've sort of watched my students get better at critical thinking, which is very motivating for me as a teacher. So I'm going to finish there, and we can have some question and answer. So I don't know if Valentina wanted to maybe identify some questions that came up in the chat box that maybe I haven't answered yet.
Let me see, because there were some questions before. Just a second.
If anybody would like to ask a question now, you can go ahead and write it in the chat box. I'd be happy to answer any sort of practical questions about implementing it in class. As I said, I've tried all these with my students. Or any questions sort of more generally about critical thinking. I'd be happy to answer those as well.
Yes, someone asked if it's possible to have a copy of the DIY speaking worksheet.
So that is in the teacher's book for the new Ready for B2 first course. So you'd have to buy that book. You'd have to buy the teacher's book in order to have access to that. Kashmir could tell me better whether that's sort of on the market now, whether that is something you could just go ahead and buy, or if that's still...
Yeah, a lot of times, if I can just answer that quickly, a lot of times teachers can just approach their mandatory book representative, the book agent, and very often the book agent can give it to them for free. So whoever your book agent is, you can approach them and ask them if you could get a copy, and very often they're able to just get it for you. So
great.
Okay, there isn't. So basically, they can. Everybody can get in touch with the local sales representatives. Is that correct, Casimir?
Yeah, people can get in touch with the sales representative, especially people who are in the who teach in the upper secondary. They can approach their representative, and the representative is very often able to get them sample copies, evaluation.
Absolutely. Thank you. There's someone who asked Ethan if you could show the last slide, please. They would like to.
This one?
Is it this one? I hope it is this one.
It might be this one. It might be the list of things. Is this the one you wanted?
Maybe this one. A few other ideas, I think. Then someone, Elettra, asked if you can give us a list of suggested books.
Yes. Well, I have a. Well, as you can probably tell, I'm kind of an avid reader of ELT books. One idea, book that I've gotten some really great ideas from is called Critical Thinking in ELT. It's by Paul Demet and John Hughes. That's a great book. This one's great, English for 21st Century Skills. I've gotten some great ideas from this one. And this one's called 21st Century Skills in the ELT Classroom. Maybe I can put those in the chat box.
Yes, that would be great.
And you can actually read them. But yeah, this list that is up on the screen actually comes from a different book called How to Write Critical Thinking Activities. So it's a book literally about writing this type of activity. So that's another good resource. It's the citation is at the bottom of the page there.
Yes, if you could write down in the chat the titles, I think it would be
I'll do that.
very useful.
I was going to wait until I had finished answering questions, but if
absolutely. I'm just going back to look if there are other questions, because here there is another question. What about listening? How do you suggest helping students improve their listening skills? This is from Lena.
Yes, that's an interesting one. So I think that one activity that's extremely useful in exam preparation, which involves critical thinking, is to have students kind of correct the activity themselves. So you have them do the listening, and then you would give them the tape script, and then have them kind of check their answer with the tape script. And then you can give them the correct answer. And then if they've gotten one wrong, then you send them back to the tape script once more, and you try to get them to think about why their answer was incorrect, and they have to explain that. And then they have to explain why the answer was correct. And if you get students to really engage with the text, that makes a big difference because students start to understand kind of the logic of the exam, because there's a lot of distractors, as we all know, on these exams. And training students to understand how that distraction works is extremely effective, and of course involves a degree of analysis, which is a critical thinking skill.
Absolutely, I think it's really a great, idea to have the students correct their activity, their listening activity by reading the tape script. Absolutely.
Yes, I think it's an underused resource. I think the tape script. I think maybe teachers are afraid to use it because it's a listening activity, so it's really about listening. But particularly at the beginning, when you're supporting students and training them how to answer questions, it's a very effective resource to use. I use it a lot.
Yes, and plus, I mean, it's true that it's a listening activity, but you transform that in, a cross kind of activity involving both the listening skills and reading ones. So
Absolutely.
I think,
absolutely. And
great
if they're
idea.
doing it with a pair or in a group, they're actually talking to each other, so they're practicing their speaking as well.
Speaking as well, absolutely, yes, and also critical thinking, because in the end they're analyzing, and text and ideas and they're proposing things. Absolutely, thank you, Ethan. Let me go back if there are other questions I might have not read before. Nadine is suggesting something. She's giving an example, writing a story from front cards made by them and then shuffled. So a kind of group work. I don't know what you think about that, Ethan.
I'm a big fan of students working together in groups. As I said before, that's something advocated by the movement for 21st century skills, that sort of knowledge, it can be co-constructed among students in groups, and that is a very valuable learning instrument, basically.
Absolutely. There's another question by Julie, and I'm answering this one because she said that she missed the first 20 minutes, but it's no worry, don't worry, because no problem. You can watch this webinar, the video, from the YouTube channel of Mediateca Montanari. The recording will be there, and we will also share the recording on the website of Liceo Nolfi-Apolloni webpage. Okay, there will be a section dedicated to Think Outside the Box, and you will be able to find the recording there as well. Let me see. Lots of people saying. Okay, someone else is asking. Hang on, because lots of people are, saying thank you. Great webinar, very interesting. Then there's a question: what if you have one-to-one lessons? Any suggestions for this kind of situations?
So you would have to cut out the collaborative group.
Absolutely.
But you could still be doing analysis. You could basically, instead of just explaining things to students, you could give them a task that requires them to analyze something in order to discover the most important information. So you could you could have students create their own tasks. You just wouldn't have another person to give them to, basically. But that doesn't mean they couldn't create their own task, and you could sort of give them some feedback on how well they did it and how they could do it better.
Yes, you still have the interaction between the student and teacher, basically.
Yeah. So there would be, of course, speaking and interaction involved in there, even if there weren't other students to work with.
Then there is another question, Ethan, from Jessica. How do we do these activities in DAD, so teaching and learning at distance?
So obviously it depends on whether you're doing what are called synchronous classes, where you're using a teleconferencing app like this one, or if you're doing asynchronous classes through an LMS or learning sort of like a Moodle type of platform. It is possible to get students to do collaborative tasks in asynchronous classes, sort of via email. For example, they could be, you could select a text and they could be sort of working on it together somehow. Although that does seem a bit problematic, to be honest. But I have taught a lot on Zoom, particularly during the first lockdown in Madrid. And so I've had students do this type of work in breakout rooms. To me, there's no reason why students can't be doing this in a breakout room. One student could be sharing their screen, particularly, well, I'm talking about the DIY task. They could be sharing their screens and sort of working on it together in a shared document using Google Docs, for example. But I think that basically any type of collaborative work actually works pretty well on Zoom. I think a breakout room is actually a good place for collaborative group work. It seems to work pretty well in my experience.
Thank you. Let me see something else. Yes, someone was suggesting, you can use breakout rooms for group work, absolutely, which is what you were saying, indeed. This one, let's see. Okay, lots of people saying thank you, very interesting. Something else here. I hope I not to miss anyone. Here it is. What is the greatest difficulty you had to deal with when trying to teach critical thinking to students? What did you find the most difficult thing?
So when we talk about higher order thinking skills, we are asking students to work a little harder, which does require motivation, certainly. But I actually think that asking students to do something demanding and hopefully interesting can actually increase motivation as well. So that obviously if you have a group that's maybe just not feeling very motivated one day, giving them something demanding to do might be, a little bit difficult. But at the same time, I think if we kind of raise the expectations for our students, often they want to meet those expectations. I think that we should be giving our students difficult things to do in class. We should be challenging them. And we just need to think of the best way of supporting them. So perhaps finding the best way to support students while they are doing something that's sort of cognitively challenging might be a challenge. But I think if you sort of think through how you could help students do the task, sort of think about what support they might need before you go into the lesson, usually you'll be able to identify sort of ways that you could add a bit of differentiation within the group work or within the activity to help students, maybe some students that are struggling with the task, as you would in any type of classroom task, really.
Thank you. There's another question from Jessica. How can we make the activities into a game?
Well, I'm not prepared for that question. I have to say, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not completely convinced by this sort of gamification strand of education. I think games are great. I think they can be a way of sort of spicing up controlled practice, for example. But I'm not sure that I would want to spend most of my class doing games. I think that this type of activity isn't fun in the way that a game is going to be fun. I think it's interesting and engaging. So I don't have a good answer for turning these activities into games, to be perfectly honest with you. Maybe I'm not the best sort of reference for games in class.
Even though I have to say that, I mean, these activities you've presented us this afternoon, which are, I mean, extremely interesting and useful, and we can, and I'm sure most of us or many of us will try to apply them in class. But thinking of the B2 first exam format, I've always thought, and this is something I keep saying to my students, especially the use of English part, which is normally considered the most difficult by students. I mean, I always suggest that, they should look at them as a kind of, crosswords, kind of games with words and text, because this is what they really are, aren't they? If you think of, when you've got the text and you have to fill in the gaps, giving one word and you're given the stem on the side, I think it's really playing a game, very similar
like
to
puzzle.
crosswords.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
A matter of point of view.
That's a great way of thinking about it. See, you just thought of a great way of turning this into a game. It's a crossword. It's not a easy thing. I like that. That's nice. I'm going to use it.
There is, okay, Julie is saying, let me read this one. You can get students to make Kahoot quizzes on word formation and part 1 reading, phrasal verbs, collocations, etc.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Kahoot is great. I didn't mean to sort of diss games before. I think games have their place. And as I said, I think with controlled practice, if you're reviewing vocabulary, Kahoot is wonderful. I use it for sure, particularly teens. Yeah, I think I just don't necessarily associate Kahoot with critical thinking.
No. I agree. There is another comment by Nadine. I think that when students are engaged in creative tasks, they really enjoy it, which is true, I think. What do you think, Ethan?
Yeah.
Casimir as well, of course.
I would agree with that. Mm-hmm.
Lella, this is from Lella. Pronunciation and intonation, how can they be exploited?
I guess I would need a sort of more context for that. So is this within the context of the speaking activities that I mentioned?
I guess so. Lella?
So I think that basically one way that most course books actually exploit pronunciation for the use of sort of critical thinking is giving students like an inductive approach, basically giving them samples of language and then asking them, what do you notice about the intonation in this sentence, or what do you notice about the tone unit, how it's changing in one part of the sentence, getting students to basically analyze a sample of language. In fact, in the new Ready for B2 First book, there are new pronunciation sections in each of the units, and Roy has done a very interesting job of identifying pronunciation features that are important for the B2 First exam, and thinking about this kind of inductive type of work that students can do with it, where you're not just kind of giving them all the information, but rather asking them to think about it and analyze it before they use it.
Okay. I would say that I was looking at the clock because on my watch. It's time because I know that Ethan has got another meeting. Okay, very soon.
Yeah, I'm actually going to class. 15 minutes.
So thank you very much, and I would pass on. Thank you, Ethan. Okay, it has been extremely interesting, really useful. I might send you a couple of other questions which are on the chat via email, and I would pass on to Casimir. Casimir, if you want to add something before we close this webinar, it would be great, I think.
Okay, thank you, Valentina. And I just want to thank Ethan again. That was a really wonderful presentation. And want to thank everyone for attending. As I mentioned before, we can, there are some samples available to, especially to upper secondary teachers who are preparing students for this exam. So you can get in touch with your local Mondadori book representative, and that person would probably be able to get you some additional information. However, my colleague Romina and I will put our emails in the chat box. If you've got additional questions or comments, do let us know, and we'll be sure to pass them on to Ethan or to try to answer them ourselves. So I'll put mine in right now, and thank you all, and I hope to catch you the next time live, face to face rather than online. But thanks again. Thank you very much, Valentina. Appreciate it.
Thank you to everybody. Just let me remind you the next and last webinar of this year series, which will be on Thursday, the 29th of April, and it will be with Elisa Bolski from the Italian Virginia Woolf Society, and it will be about Virginia Woolf, so literature. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Casimir. Thank you, Romina. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Valeria. Thank you, Camilla. Thank you, Professor Giombi. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you again. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Bye-bye.